That's the good stuff right here. Hard, soft literature. Yeah. I mean, sort of, kind of. I tell you what, I'll check it out. You know, I'm not normally one to destroy books, but I'm just kind of big for it. Hiya folks, Fruit and Doggy here to do another book discussion, and this time it is on the Medusa in the Shield, and that is not showing up whatsoever. A little better. This is a horror short story compilation. This was published in 1987, but unlike many of these styles of compilations, instead of just from the last, shall we say, 5 to 10 years within the last decade, this one pulls from as early as 1950, as far as the copyrights at least, and I'm basing that on the copyright acknowledgement near the very beginning of the book. And this compilation is just shy of 500 pages. And I would admit that I think part of the reason that this winds up being a strange compilation of stories is simply the fact that it pulls from such a wide range of years. I think that's at least part of it. And I'll mention that I think the copyrights must be screwy, because unless I am gravely mistaken about my authors, Edgar Allan Poe is not from the 1950s. But regardless, I'm raising that up because one of his stories is in here. Excuse me, darn coughing. Cough in. But again, I think this winds up just being a strange compilation because I read this quite a few years ago, and some of these stories I actually remembered pretty well. I probably read these more than 10, 15 years ago, give or take, probably a little bit under the recommended age based on them being horror stories. But some of them are pretty good, some of them are worth remembering, but many of the ones that I didn't remember, that I didn't even really recognize as I was rereading them, they really missed the mark pretty strongly. And a lot of it, pardon me, man, my cough's really bad right now. A lot of it had to do with the fact that those stories that didn't hit the mark really just didn't make sense. I got the idea that there was supposed to be an element of some style of dread, something macabre was taking place, but it was hard to really follow along with the events. And by the time the story was over, it was simply too unclear what really took place and even what the horror element was. So, for instance, even though a character had died, it wasn't really clear perhaps what caused them to die, if it was anything beyond basically a psychopath with a knife, just to use such a basic example. And I think it's okay for a short story and a horror story to be a little unclear on the specifics, for it to be somewhat of the unexplained. That can help make it seem more foreboding, more mysterious and dark, because we don't even know what happened exactly. We don't know, not that we didn't know what had happened, but we don't know as readers what this entity was, where it came from, what it's fully capable of, if it can't, what can stop it, if it can be stopped by, sheer mortal men. But if it's a head scratcher and you simply don't really know what took place, and it's all confusing and perplexing, then it's just too it's baffling, it's confusing, and it loses a sense of horror at that point. I can't dread what I don't even know was happening. Some of the stories that actually I'll mention the story that kind of sets the rephrasing all of that, and on that same note, the very first story in the book, excuse me, is somewhat of that style. It's called The Swords, and it's a little long-winded for what's a fairly straightforward premise. A young man encounters a carnival. It's pretty shabby, and he observes a very bizarre show where a young lady is sitting on a chair. The male, I'm not sure if this is entirely on purpose or not, but the audience is comprised exclusively of men, and there's a table full of swords, and then each man is called forward to take a sword and stab it directly into her. And where this winds up is, by the end, he essentially hires her to be a prostitute, and after they have sex, he gets a bit rough with her, yanks her hand off, and then she just leaves. And that is really what happens at the very end, with no explanation at all as to what took place as far as was, her being stabbed. Is she a ghoul? Is she undead? It's completely unknown. And I didn't get it because it didn't seem as if there was really anything to get. Excuse me. I suppose I'll mention that as she was being stabbed and otherwise mistreated, she pretty much smiled and grinned through it. It was only when she was handled roughly and her hand was yanked out that she became upset. And I didn't get that at all, because it didn't demonstrate that she had taken mortal damage. She was egregiously injured. So I didn't get it. And that seemed like, frankly, one of the worst stories that I could have opened with, because it was just perplexing. And a few other stories were of that same style, and I'm not going to go through each one of them because, in essence, I would try to summarize it and then just say something wasn't clear, something wasn't obvious, I didn't get it, and it was just kind of a mess. Instead, I would look at a few of the stories that I thought were pretty good, or at least more interesting. One of which was The Roaches, where basically the main character is deathly afraid of roaches, extremely grossed out, and then winds up having some sort of special link, and she can control and direct what they do. Now, in that case, it's completely unexplained how that takes place, how that transpires, but the story is otherwise fairly clear, and it's to the point. And so it didn't, and it's even shorter than the first story, The Swords, but it was more effective overall. Excuse me. Stephen King's The Monkey, I thought that one was pretty good. It was a bit on the long side, and it's a little bit silly that when it says the monkey, going with a more modern reference on Toy Story 3, the monkey that was basically acting as a security guard watching all the cameras, the monkey with the symbols. That's what the monkey is referring to in the short story. And and it is as basic a premise as whenever the monkey is wound up and starts clanging its cymbals, it kills something. It can be as basic as an insect, or it can kill a human being. And I think the reason I detract a little bit from it is because, one, it's such a silly thing to be somewhat scared of or to be menacing, even though they're kind of macabre looking. I can appreciate that a little bit, but I just think the demon possessed, vengeful or hateful inanimate object has been done a few times already. Now, by the time this is an older compilation, so perhaps when Stephen King wrote that short story, it wasn't so overplayed at that time, but I'm reminded of the take a picture with a camera and the image it shows is really horrible because it's predicting a future, but is it causing it or is it merely predicting it? And I don't know. I just find that to be a little repetitive. Trying to think if there were any other stories that really stood out as a positive. There was one that was very short, where it basically described. It's called "Born of Man and Woman," and it's barely like 3-4 pages long, and it describes at first what seems to be just a young child chained up in the basement and being neglected or abused, but then by the time the story ends, it turns out that yes, it was their child, but it's quite inhuman, whatever it is. It's fairly effective. I mean, with only 4 pages to work with, it wasn't going to have a lot of time to build up into it, but it wasn't bad. It was at least a quick read, if nothing else. The Rocking Horse winner was a very bizarre idea. What happened in that one was basically a young boy gets a rocking horse, and then every time he gets on the horse and he starts rocking, he's able to see who's going to win the big horse race. And definitely in our current day and age, horse racing has really lost prominence. But I just didn't really care for the execution too much. It wasn't. It fits into the horror category, but it wasn't really scary. Maybe sort of grim, but I just didn't really get the point by the time I was done with it. But I mean, there's a few others here and there that some were okay, but overall, I'd say this compilation, I just don't think it really holds up as a whole. I would say there's a few short stories that are probably worth salvaging, that would be worth looking into, but I just don't think this one is worth digging up out of the grave, if you will. And I think it would be a shame to get rid of every short story in here to toss it all into the fire, but I don't know if I'd even really recommend borrowing it. Again, there's just too many misses in this compilation. There's too many stories that don't make sense, that don't really direct the reader incredibly well, where you just don't know what's going on. I've already said that point a few times, so I'm just gonna end it there. I'd say burn it overall, maybe salvage a couple stories. But anyways, hope you enjoyed, folks, and as always, fruit and doggy.